Now this is a great subject. One way to instantly up your game is to learn off-camera flash. I can't stress enough how much it improved the quality of my work and what it did for my confidence in low light situations. When I learned the fundamentals, it only took me 2 weddings before I was confident with it. Then over time, you experiment with gels and modifiers, and it doesn't have to be a hassle, you know. If you've been putting it off because you think it's gonna stress you out on the day or because you're a natural light photographer, I'm telling you now, it's not hard to learn. And in this video, I'm gonna walk you through how I made this photo of a first dance using 3 off-camera flashes. Here we go. So this is a technique that the more you practice, the better you get, obviously. But when you start getting those first shots, your confidence will fly. I'm going to run through exactly how I captured that first dance photo and also give you a visual run through of how the flashes were actually controlled. Now, it doesn't matter if you're photographing weddings or events or products, whatever you're shooting, this workflow remains the same. It also doesn't matter what speed lights you have, but if you do want some advice on which ones to buy without caning your bank account, then these Yongnuo 560 Mark IV with this trigger a great place to start. You know, they each have receive and transmit functionality. You can set each light's power and zoom individually, or you can group them together. They're relatively cheap, so if you accidentally damage one, you're not going to get too upset. They don't tick every box. For example, they're manual flashes, so they don't have through the lens functionality, not that I ever use it. They also don't have high speed sync, which is where you want to use a shutter speed faster than about 200th of a second, depending on which camera you use. They don't have second curtain sync, which is where the flash fires just before the second curtain drops. But that doesn't matter in my opinion. If you need decent flashes for cheap that will last for years, these are ace. So check them out, links below. Also, this might be obvious, but you're going to need to mount your flashes on something. So a decent light stand and an adapter to hold the flashes on is required in most scenarios. You'll actually see in this example photo that I'm going to run through that one of the flashes wasn't on a light stand at all, but I'll get to that in a second. If you are using a light stand and an adapter, at one end of the spectrum, you've got this screwy little grippy thing, dead cheap. And at the other end, but definitely easier to use, you've got something like the Magmod mag shoe. I used this cheap screwy thing for years, and depending on your budget, you can purchase accordingly, but once you use the mag shoe, you ain't going back. If you've already got another brand of speed light that you want to use, that's cool. The principle remains the same for all. So now we've got all of that out of the way, let's get down to the how. So first things first, you want to be shooting in manual mode. Why? Because you want to control your ambient exposure. And what I mean by that is that you want to control everything that your flashes don't light up, the light in the room. So much like this video, my camera is set to the ambient light. Then I control the power of the light, in this case a continuous light, to fill in the subject, me. The principle is exactly the same with your flashes, except they aren't constantly on, they just flash when you press the shutter. Simple, right? So let's jump into this first dance. I've had selected 6 photos here to look at. The first shot is my ambient exposure, just bright enough to expose for the love letters and the wall lampshades. Now you can't see them here, but the bride and groom are right in the middle of this image, and if I crank the exposure up to max, you can see them here. So this is the point in the day where they've just cut their cake and they're about to begin their first dance. My camera's on manual. My settings are locked. You can see here ISO 640, I'm at f4 and a shutter of 160th of a second. These settings don't change. My next shot, I've switched on my flash trigger and now you can see the couple. So before you tear me apart on composition here, this was just another test shot before getting stuck in. The power of my flashes was set to 1/64th power, so really low power. The zoom of the flashes I always set to their longest focal length in these scenarios, so 105mm, because I want to have a very narrow flash beam. And I also use one of these honeycomb grids to focus the lights even more directly, because it limits the spread of the light as much as I can. I'll leave a link to these modifiers below. I make another video on how I use them at weddings. Keep an eye out for that. So you can see one flash behind the groom. That creates this rim light around him, and I'm looking at the bride here and checking she's not overexposed. I'm happy with these settings, so off I go. I can, of course, change the speed light settings individually here. Say if the exposure was too bright from one of the particular flashes, I can change the power of each flash individually before I continue to shoot the first dance, and I'll go through how that's done in a mo. This next photo is from the other side. It shows the flash that was lighting the bride just then. Now, you might be wondering why a guest is holding the flash. There isn't any real reason for this. I mean, if I zoom in, you can actually see my light stand that I was planning to use, but I think she just said, "Can I help?" She just offered to help, and I thought, yeah, great, why not? Hold this flash, point it at them. I didn't overthink it. If anything, I thought it might be quite a nice thing to happen. Anyway, you can see on the right of this frame that this chap's head is being lit from the other flash that was behind the groom. So if I go back one photo, I'm talking about this one. So moving forward again, this wide shot gives a great idea of my 3 flash positions, and I've set these up into 3 groups, A, B and C, so I can control each flash's power individually directly from the trigger on top of the camera. More on that in a second, but on the left you can see my mate, whatever her name was, holding flash A, then flash B at the back, and flash C on the right, all set to the same power. These photos are straight out of camera, by the way. They're raw, don't judge, they're naked. So shot 5 shows only one flash firing, B and C. Well, obviously slow to recycle or something, but what this photo does show quite nicely is how my ambient exposure still captures the love letters, the wall lights, and the fairy lights nicely. I mean, I know flash A is still fired, but you can still see what I get from my ambient exposure. Then shot 6 shows that they are awake again. So I could have placed a 4 flash here actually, this side of the couple, to ensure that whichever side I stood, I'd be covered, but I'm actually really happy with these. Now, obviously there were more than just these 3, but to keep it simple, here they are once they've had an edit. So let's recap. You firstly set your camera to manual and get your exposure for ambient light. And when you've done that, you turn on your trigger and set your flash powers and zooms. The more you do this, the better you'll get at setting your flashes to the right power straight off the bat. After about half a dozen weddings, I was able to set the flashes to the right power as well as my camera to the right settings, and without even making a test shot, I knew that I'd be either bang on or very close to the settings that I wanted. It's all about practice. Now I do it without even thinking. So just quickly going back to this wide image, remember I said that each flash was in its own group, A, B and C, and a good tip is to set them up like this logically around the room so you can't forget which is which. And why I do it like this is because of the couple. If the couple start moving really close to one flash, I can quickly lower the power of that flash so they don't get overexposed. So let's take a quick look at how I set each power and zoom without touching the flash units. So my 3 flash units are on their stands in the location I want them around the room. You might have to use your imagination here. I turn each of them on. And then I set them to receive mode by pressing this button. Now each of the flashes are in receive mode. I need to put them into their individual groups. So I'm going to set this one to A, this one to B, and this one to C. So I press the middle button and change that from B to A, this C to B, this from A up to C. Now I could have just moved them around in the environment that they were in, but it's easy to just change the groups that they are in. So now we have flash A, flash B, and flash C, all set in receive mode. Next, I set my camera to manual and change the exposure to the ambient light in the room. Then I switch on the trigger and I set all my flashes to the same power and zoom. So we're currently on group B here, and I can change, so that's the middle one, I can change the power of this to 1/64th. I change the group, that will shift down to C, so this one, change that to 1/64th, and again to A, 64. So they're now all the same power. I want to change the zooms. This A and B are currently set to 105, which is great. I want to change C to 105 as well. So I change the group down to C, hit zoom, it's currently on 24, and I can change it to 105. I can, of course, scroll through all of the other focal lengths as well. And that's it. I can change the power of each flash without going over to the flash unit itself. So it doesn't matter what brand of speed light you have, whether you shoot Canon, Sony, Nikon, Fuji, whatever. These principles apply globally. The only difference, of course, is that your speed light and your camera may have buttons in different places, you know? So shoot in manual, then set your ambient exposure with that, and then turn on your flashes. That goes for weddings, products, whatever you're shooting. Follow that procedure, practice, and you're away. That is the end of this video, but before I go, I just want to say that these flashes also have another great function. It can act as a master flash, so when it sits on the top of your camera, you press the shutter on this, and not only does this one fire, it triggers the other flashes around the room to fire too. And this is especially great when you're on a busy dance floor, or when you're amongst a load of people and your flashes around the room become blocked because it's busy, you know. Please support me by subscribing and liking the video too. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Thank you for your time and your support. I'll see you again.